Hi everyone. This is a tutorial that's been underway for quite a while and that I'm still not actually that finished with. You'll notice this once I get to the PowerPoint. It's not finished yet. It lacks illustrations and stuff like that. And there's a lot of what I'm going to talk about that could actually be illustrated with a picture from a game. Haven't got the time or the energy to gather it all up or to set it all up. So it's a half-finished product. I don't think it's bad though. This is going to be a tutorial about tanks in bold action, and I am going to give you. There we go. So tanks in bold action. As per usual, there are a few disclaimers. One, this is just what I'm seeing, just how I'm seeing tanks being used in the game. So there may be other ways that they're used that I haven't really covered here. That might be a thing, I don't know. But I think I have quite an extensive knowledge of bold action so far. I may still get stuff wrong, but I've seen a lot of games. I've played a lot of games. I have seen a lot of players, good, very good players, do stuff with their tanks. So I think I know more or less what it is that is done competitively, at least. And this is only competitive bold action I'm talking about. I'm not talking about how tanks would be used in real life or how you simulate a battle using tanks in your force. All of that, not what I'm doing here. I'm talking about how tanks are used in a generic reinforced platoon at a tournament. That's it. And I also add that there are certain tanks that I'm not really covering here. I'm covering the main types, and there are 5 in my opinion. But there are certain tanks that won't really fit into this, either because they're multi-purpose, have different roles, or because they just fall in between chairs somehow. So there are some tank choices like the SS Key, which is a flamethrower tank that has multiple flamethrowers, can only fire one a turn, but how do you define that? It doesn't really fit into any of my builds anyways. So let's go. Let's talk about the builds first. I said that there were 5 builds that I'm seeing, and that's basically what I'm seeing. The most competitive one being the Darker Tank. The Darker Tank being defined by the ability to split fire, so you can fire multiple units, having 10 or more shots, and machine gun shots mainly, and having a relatively low armor so that the cost is also low. Most Darker Tanks have 8 plus armor. Some might be into the 7 area. Very few are 9 plus. I don't think I can come up with a single Darker Tank that is a 9 plus actually. The Lee, maybe. But that's not really a Darker Tank. Again, the Lee is it's a tank that doesn't really fit into any of these builds easily. Then we have the AA tank, the autocannon tank, which typically has autocannon, one or more, and low armor. And then we have the tank hunter, which is typically with a medium anti-tank gun or more, has low to medium armor depending on the build and how good it is. Sometimes will be open topped as well. I have my Wolverine standing right over here, ready to go for a game I'm going to tomorrow. So, and that's the tank hunter, right? Even though maybe not the best one. Then we have the Death Star tank. The Death Star typically has a medium plus AT gun. Many of them will have a heavy AT gun, and it has high armor. So 9 plus, 10 plus, 11 plus. High armor. That's what defines a Death Star. And typically, this build, it won't really work in bold action because the tank actually is way overcosted for what it delivers. It's just way too expensive. So the Death Star tanks in bold action doesn't really work. And you do see them sometimes, especially the German tanks, because they're just so damn cool. But they typically don't do much. And then finally, we have the mobile artillery piece, which is basically a howitzer sitting on a chassis of a tank of some sort. This can be open or closed. There are different versions of many of the tanks that can take a howitzer instead of an AT gun. All of them I would place in this role as the mobile artillery piece. So, what are the tactics that I'm seeing being used here? Well, there are some common tactics, some tactics that I see being used for all tanks. One is that people will use the tank to dominate a certain area because the tank has a lot of presence and it's typically a little bit more dangerous than your average infantry unit, right? Because it can shoot HE or because it has multiple machine guns, it is a lot more dangerous. And because it's not vulnerable to small arms fire, means that the enemy will have to bring special weapons to bear on it, which means that they'll have to bring up those resources, which again can be difficult, although maybe not always is. So typically, you can use a tank to dominate a certain area, um, and and have a presence there that suppresses the enemy or pushes the enemy away. So that is a thing that I'm seeing a lot of tanks doing. Then there is tactics that I have done myself, and it's brilliant when it works. Doesn't always, but sometimes you'll get lucky, and this will happen to you. You take your tank, then you aim it at the enemy's artillery piece, and then you charge. Um, because a tank that drives over an artillery piece instantly kills that artillery piece. So tanking the guns is actually a thing. You don't need to shoot the guns. You can just roll over them. It'll die. Um, so for me, that's a brilliant tactic. I've done it in a few games, and it's always great fun when it works. It does become a little situational, and it does mean that you're standing there right in front of a howitzer when you want to do the charge, which can be a little dangerous. But it's a common tactic that all of these tank builds can do, and sometimes will do, even though it happens rarely, like 1 in 20 games or something like that. It will happen. When it does, it's cool. Another thing that will quite often happen is that your tank has an HE gun of some sort, either an anti-tank gun or a howitzer. Like there are very few tanks that doesn't have an HE shot. So introducing the enemy infantry to your HE shot, meet howitzer, is a real thing. And I see this done a lot. That people will shoot their HE gun at infantry, maybe especially at veteran infantry, because veterans can be difficult to kill with machine guns. So sometimes it's just worth more to shoot that 2-inch template at that veteran unit sitting on an objective, right? And I had this happen to me at the last tournament I was at, where Danny he fired his Hellcat at a regular unit of mine, took the shot. He needed a 6. He got it, and boom, the whole unit was gone. Right. So that HE shot can be devastating. Um, there is a caveat here, and that is that most typically you will want to go last, because going last will mean that you can shoot at stuff that hasn't got the ability to go down. Because when you're shooting your HE at that one unit, if I had my unit, if that still hadn't done anything when Danny shot at me, I would have just gone down. He would have missed. So because then it would have been a 7. That's fairly unlikely. So typically you'll see tanks wanting to go late in the turn, unless it's in the middle of the game where suddenly the tank it becomes very important which tank moves first, or there's an anti-tank team going at it or something. Then it can be really important that the tank moves first, but typically you'll see the tanks going last. So these are the common tactics that I see across all types of tanks. Now, specifics. Let's take them from the back. So mobile artillery tactics first. And here I'm talking about Horos, the Priest, the Stummels, whatever. You can fill in the blanks here. They're often open topped, as I talked about. They are often tracked and typically have fairly low armor. Now, one thing that I see most people who field this do is they will deploy them very, very late as humanly possible when you're pulling the order dice to see what deploys first, or if you have first wave, they will try to be the last thing on the board because that mobile artillery piece is vulnerable and it needs the right lines of sight. So it's vulnerable. Typically, if it's open top, it's vulnerable to small arms fire, right? So that's bad. So the owner will typically try to make sure that it's away from that and it's deployed where it can see what it needs to see, but that means going last. Typically, that going last will also mean a backline parking. So you will deploy your artillery piece right on your own backline, as far back as you can go, because you don't want the enemy small arms to be able to reach you. They'll typically have 24-inch range, so you don't want to push all the way up until the edge of your deployment zone, right? You want to be back with your artillery piece, way back in your own deployment zone, if you can, where they can't reach you, but you can reach them because you have more range typically with an artillery piece. And because you're mobile, you can move a little bit back and forth and you can push it into area terrain, which is the extra area terrain armor that I'm talking about here. You'll see this done again and again and again. That the owner of a mobile artillery piece will move that artillery piece into area terrain, preferably a ruin, but a forest can do. They'll move into that area terrain because now the area terrain gives them cover. It sort of acts like an extra layer of armor that makes sure that the enemy can't really hit them as well as they possibly could otherwise, right? And they'll sit there in the area terrain unless something starts zeroing in on that artillery piece. They will just sit there shooting out. And typically they'll stick their front out of the area terrain so that the breach can shoot out without giving cover to whatever they're shooting at. That is extra terrain armor. Now, what I'll also see, what I also see done is then right behind that area terrain, the owner will typically place a lieutenant because the lieutenants are there to make sure that when you do get pinned, which will happen because there are snipers and the enemy will move up their skirmishes or long range machine gun shots will get you, whatever. When you do get pinned, the lieutenant is there to make sure that you make the order test and shoot next turn. So they will typically make sure that the Horo is in command of their lieutenant. Right, so those are the tactics that I'm seeing mobile artillery pieces deploy here. And as to targets, well, they typically again shoot at other tanks that they want to pin, or infantry units, veterans that they want to kill, houses especially, and then they can zero in on the enemy's artillery pieces as well. So they act as like a third. So you have a mortar, you have a regular artillery piece, and then you have a third artillery piece in your army, right? A leaf blower list. Yeah. If we're talking about Death Stars, though, and this is the one that doesn't really work, but there's a lot of things that people have tried and are trying to do with Death Stars. And we're talking about the Tigers, the Fireflies, the T-34s. You have something that has 9+ armor and a medium or a heavy or super heavy AT gun. Basically, that is what you're looking at. That's the Death Star. Typically, they're also very, very expensive. Now, what people try to do with this is to lure you into shooting your stuff at the Death Star, because they can be a bullet magnet that can really shrug off a lot of punishment because of their heavy armor. So they will talk up their and this is maybe more of a psychological trick. They'll try to make sure that the enemy knows how dangerous this tank is. Some players will even paint it up really nicely, because the more nice it is, the bigger it is, the bigger the footprint of the tank as well, by the way, the larger that flag on it is, the more of a threat it does seem, and the more the enemy will try to focus on it and shoot their Panzerfausts and their bazookas and their HE pieces at it, which is what you want them to do, because that will mean that the rest of your army is free to act. This is the tactic that I used when I played 40k. I played the Eldar Jetseer Council, and I would use my Jetseer Council to absolutely soak up damage. All the enemy would focus on my Jetseers, and he couldn't kill it. Well, he could maybe kill one or two, but it rarely happened. But what it did allow me to do was it allowed me to move all the rest of my army at will. So this is a psychological trick that you shouldn't really fall for. What will typically happen is that the owner of a Death Star will try to take the central position, which is, I think, the only way to run a Death Star unit and do so relatively well. You need to be in the center of the board where all the action is. So if there are objectives, you need to be right in the center of those objectives where you can shoot at everything that comes at you. And that's because you do have that heavy armor. You can take punishment. So take the central position, because typically the person who holds the central position, the center of the board, will typically win the game. This doesn't really work for Death Star builds because the Death Star is so expensive that the rest of the army can't really follow up on the owning of that central position, but they will try anyway. And sometimes they can do what's called an objective park, where if you have an objective, because objectives are just points on the map, you can drive your Death Star on top of that objective and sit there. Now, the enemy can't get to the objective. If you're large enough, if you have a Tiger tanks, for instance, because the enemy can't get within 1 inch of you, unless they kill you, then they can't actually contest that objective anymore. You can't take it either, but hey, you can maybe take it last turn, but the enemy can't get to it, which is the main point. So you can make sure that the enemy can't take an objective by simply parking on it with a large enough tank, which is the objective park. Brilliant. I saw this done at the last tournament I was at, where one player, Jonathan, had a Panther, and he drove onto an objective at one point in one of his games. So that is basically what you can do. This has the added effect that typically being on that objective will mean that you're in the central position and you are a bullet magnet, that the enemy will try to kill you. So all three will combine into that one objective park. And again, Death Stars also really benefit from the extra area terrain armor. So if you can make sure that the central objective, the most important objective, is in an area terrain, in a ruin, and then drive your Tiger tank on top of that, perfect. That is good Death Star tactics. Will it be enough? I doubt it, but it's the way that you can do and can do semi well with the Death Stars, I think. It's what you should do, at least. It's the best we've got. Basically, it's the best we've got. Right. Let's move to the more seen in competitive play units. So the Tank Hunters, for instance. The Tank Hunters would be the Hellcats, the Chaffies. We see these sometimes. Typically, they have a medium or higher anti-tank gun, fairly low armor because, well, you have to keep the point cost down, and they'll typically also have Recce, because the Recce can become important once they're up against enemy tanks. The Tank Hunters will do this. They'll go up against enemy tanks by doing the Recce dance, where they move out of cover, shoot, and typically they'll do this at the end of a turn, so going last. And then next turn, if they get the first dice, they'll shoot again. If they don't get the first dice and are shot at, they will Recce behind cover again. So Recce dancing, back and forth, back and forth. This they can do ad nauseum until either they or the enemy tank dies, and typically it will be the enemy tank because they have a higher AT gun mostly than, at least than the artillery pieces and the AA and the darker tanks. So against most of the pieces that you see competitively, they will have a better AT gun. So they will try to do that take out the enemy's tank if possible. So going last and then going first next turn. I also see that they typically try to not move up a flank, because that can mean that they can't see the enemy's tank that they want to hunt. But they'll often, if they can, if they have a diagonal, like a line down the center of the board, they'll go for that diagonal. I had this done to me at the Dutch Nationals with a player that I was facing there who had a Hellcat. And he went for that diagonal, sat there in the diagonal, trying to cut the board in two with ambush, with the threat of moving out. Which meant that my vehicles, my tanks, had to stay back. So sometimes that diagonal position can be really beneficial for you to cut the table in two. And you're not as vulnerable as an AT gun, like a fixed AT gun would be, because you do have Reiki. You're still mounted on tracks. You can move out if you want to. So yeah. Also, typically, what you'll see done is the tank hunters will typically want to be the last unit on the board. They will want to be after the enemy's tanks have deployed, so that either they can move out and take the shot first, going last and then going first, or they can be in a position where at least they know that they will have the chance later on in the game. So typically you'll see tank hunters, players who play tank hunters, being desperate to get the last order dice when you deploy. They really want that tank to go last. If they don't, they're making a mistake, and you should exploit that. So yeah, those were the tank hunter tactics. We see them sometimes in competitive tournaments, but not in massive amounts. And then we have the AA tanks, which is a new invention that's come up a little bit more over these past like 3-4 years. I'm talking about the Crusader AA. Thank you, Alistair, for that one. Mine is still on the painting bench. I'm talking about the Panzer II Lux. Thank you, Achilles, for that one. And the Kugelblitz. Thanks to the Polish national team for that one. And to the Germans, who also played a lot of Kugelblitz. So typically these tanks will have an autocannon or more. They will be tracked and they will be close-topped most of the time. If it's an open-topped AA tank, it becomes way less effective because it's vulnerable to get pinned by small arms fire, which it definitely will. So this tank works by actually ensuring that you get hits, because you have so many shots on an autocannon. So what you'll typically see them do, though, because the autocannon is not a high penetrative value, is you'll see them deploy on a flank and then try to move into your flank, like up and down and into the flank of whatever your armor is doing at the time. Preferably so that they actually can get around you and into the flank, because that will mean that they have a chance to shoot side armor or rear armor where they have a chance to kill you. If they can't do that, you'll see them shoot at you anyway. Just they will set their autocannons to stun instead of actually trying to kill. They'll just say, okay, I'll shoot HE at you because that's the 2 pins, and I'll try to get 2 pins, see what I can do. That double pin, and they're pretty likely to get a hit, right? That double pin can be brutal for your tank. So they'll try to stun out your tank with the autocannons that they can deploy if they can't kill you, which sometimes if you're in the front, you should be fairly safe, at least at range. But yeah. Another thing that I see these AA tanks do is apply their HE to buildings and veterans, because 2 HE shots, 4 HE shots, even though it's like HE1 at a building, that's still D3 hits per shot. That's a lot of kills you can get. They stack up really quickly if you hit that building and the unit inside it. So autocannons are actually really dangerous against buildings, which is kind of fun. I hadn't thought about that, but they are really dangerous against buildings. And especially also veterans clumped up on an objective. If your opponent is lazy and just moves the unit in a bunch, you can really get a lot of veterans with those two templates flipped. So applying HE instead of just shooting your anti-tank version of the autocannon can be really good, and I see this done more and more. Also because HE ignores some sort of cover, right? So you're not shooting indirectly, I know, but yeah, like buildings and stuff. Then one final thing that I see being done with this is, and this is where maybe the anti-tank, the AA tank would want to go last, is if the enemy has a multiple units in a transport. That is a perfect target for an AA tank, because you have so many shots, and you're pretty likely, at least if it's soft-skinned, to kill it. The AA tank will typically want to shoot at that one transport, and if you do kill it, then all the units inside will get damage as well. So we sometimes see an AA tank just go and try to wreck face on motorized units that sit in their trucks or their Bren carriers or what have you, just in order for them to double up on damage. So you're pretty likely to hit, and you're pretty likely to do more damage to more than one unit. That is a perfect target for the AA tank. So yeah, get out of your trucks if you're facing AA tanks as quickly as possible. And then finally, we have them, the darker tanks that are everywhere right now in the meta. The Upgun Stuart, the Darker Stuart, the Panzer III-E, the Polizei tank, and there are several others that you could lump into this category, including the Panzer I, by the way. They typically have low armor, are tracked, have 12 or more machine gun shots, and can typically split fire. If, like, some darker tanks, the Panzer I, for instance, can't really split fire, but it's still lumped into this category because it is so dirt cheap. Yeah, the tactics that people employ with these are, one, they use them as pin machines that can spread out pins before an assaulting army, or before the rest of your army moves up. Just because you can spread out at least 2 pins a turn. In some builds, 3 pins a turn, because you can split fire a lot of ways, right? So that really stacks up. It really does. And means that you have a lot of effective pinning tools in your list when you have these darker tanks. And people might not even care about, like, casualties. They just want the pins. They just want your units to take a few pins before they do stuff. The other thing that you can see them do is to focus fire for effect. That is done where you take a darker tank and take all the shots that you can at one specific unit in order to try and kill that unit. I will sometimes do this at even snipers where I need 7s. So I'll, with a Darker Stuart, that's 18 shots. If you don't have the pintle mounted, if you do, then it's 23. So that's a lot of dice that you're throwing on the table. The 7s will crop up sometimes. You'll hit that sniper and sometimes you'll kill it. Or you'll hit that truck in the enemy's back line or whatever. So that is focus firing for effect. You're basically, because you're throwing so many dice at a problem, you're ensuring that something will happen, that unit is pretty likely to get messed up. Even veterans in cover, if they're up, being hit on a 5 with 18 shots, that's at least 4 hits. It's actually more than 4 hits, right? It's 6 hits. So they're pretty likely to lose 2 veterans or more. So it's a bad day whenever a Daka tank starts shooting, focus firing at you to kill you. Um, Sometimes you'll even see people fire at units just to entice the enemy to go down with that unit. I did this in a recent game against Ollie on TTS, where I moved my steward into like right up against his. He had a flamethrower and he had a unit of continuation wall riflemen with a Panzerfaust, and I moved up and I split fire in order to entice him to go down with both units. He didn't, which meant that he lost the flamethrower, and the continuation wall, who had gone down, next turn got focused fired off the board. So he lost 2 units instead of maybe losing one, because I gave him an impossible choice. Do you stay up and take the hit, or do you go down and try to survive and then hope for next turn? Um, it's a bad situation no matter what you do. So sometimes you'll want the enemy to go down, and you can ensure that by just firing close range on certain units. You can also do the the Squid Game red light, green light, where if you have a Daka tank that sits in area terrain, the ablative armor of area terrain is always good, right? And then you go on ambush. Nothing will move in front of that. Everything will be holding back in order to move in front of that. Like the enemy will do a lot of other stuff before they want to do that. So you can basically shot down an area just by sitting there in ambush with your 12, 18 gazillion shots. Um, so consider that sometimes. If your Daka tank hasn't got a target, it doesn't need to have, you can just go on ambush, sit there and lock down that army so it doesn't want to move. I also see quite often the Daka tanks being used in flank pushes, because the Daka tank is not really beneficial to have in the central position often, because quite often the enemy will have some sort of anti-tank capabilities. But if you push them along one flank, they'll typically have one, maybe two anti-tank capabilities in their whole army, and they won't be able to cover both flanks. So you can push your Polizei, your up along one flank, and then start shooting at that anti-tank capability as you go. You'll typically pin it, and then at one point you'll kill it. And the other anti-tank capabilities will be far further away and can't actually get to you. So if you're really good and if you're really lucky, you'll actually be able to push your Daka tank all the way down into the enemy's deployment zone, killing units as you go. And then you can start turning into the center of the board. But the flank rush is a real thing for Daka tanks. So this was all I had for you guys today. This was the thoughts I have so far about what I'm seeing tanks being used in competitive bolt action, how I'm seeing them being used, how they're built, the tactics that I see employed. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.